In the heart of Chicago, a single decision is about to change everything. When John Donovan, a man with nothing left to lose, wins the lottery, he makes a choice that will shock the nation, challenge our perceptions of right and wrong, and ultimately teach us all about the true nature of humanity. But as praise turns to scorn and kindness to cruelty, John's incredible journey will force us to question everything we thought we knew about generosity, judgment, and the power of one person to change the world. Are you ready to discover a truth that will leave you breathless? The biting wind whipped through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago, carrying with it the first hints of winter. John hunched his shoulders, pulling his threadbare coat tighter around his gaunt frame. Another day on the unforgiving streets of the Windy City was beginning, and with it, the daily struggle for survival that had become his unwelcome routine. At 47, John Donovan's weathered face told the story of a man who had seen better days. His steel-gray eyes, once bright with ambition, now held a weariness that spoke of dreams long abandoned. The stubble on his chin was peppered with gray, a testament to the harsh years that had etched themselves into every line of his face. As the first rays of sunlight began to pierce the urban skyline, John emerged from the relative shelter of the L train underpass he called home. His possessions were few: a battered backpack containing a change of clothes, a dog-eared paperback, and a small photo album, the last remnants of a life left behind. The morning routine was always the same. First, a trip to the public restroom in Millennium Park to wash up as best he could. Then, a careful counting of the meager funds that jingled in his pocket, the result of yesterday's panhandling efforts. $3.27, John muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a cup of coffee at the corner bodega. The thought of the warm liquid was enough to propel his tired legs forward. As he shuffled down Michigan Avenue, John's gaze skittered over the faces of early morning commuters, lawyers, bankers, and office workers clutching their lattes and scrolling through smartphones. They moved past him in a blur, their eyes carefully avoiding his, as if his misfortune might be contagious. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when John had been one of them, a promising young accountant with a corner office and a view of Lake Michigan. He had a wife, a house in the suburbs, and a future that seemed as solid as the skyscrapers that now towered over him. But life, John had learned, was as unpredictable as Chicago weather. An economic downturn, a string of bad investments, and a spiral into depression had stripped away everything he once held dear. His wife left, the house was foreclosed, and the bottle became his only friend, until it, too, betrayed him. Now, 5 years into homelessness, each day blurred into the next in a monotonous struggle for existence. The bell above the door of Lou's corner store jingled as John entered, the warm air inside a sharp contrast to the chill outside. Lou, a portly man in his 60s with kind eyes and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, nodded in recognition. "Morning, John." "The usual?" John nodded, fishing out his coins and placing them on the counter. As Lou turned to pour the coffee, John's eyes wandered to the Powerball poster taped to the register. The jackpot, a staggering $400 million, seemed like a number from another universe. "Quite a pot, huh?" Lou commented, following John's gaze. "Seems like the whole city's gone lottery crazy. Even had a line out the door yesterday." John managed a wry smile. "Yeah, well, good luck to them. That kind of money, it's not even real, you know?" Lou shrugged, sliding the steaming cup across the counter. "Real enough to change a life, I reckon. Hell, John, for $2 you could buy yourself a dream. Might be worth it just for that." Something in Lou's words struck a chord. A dream. When was the last time John had allowed himself to dream? The concept seemed as foreign to him now as the luxury cars that cruised past his sleeping spot each night. His hand lingered on the coins still on the counter. $3.27. Enough for coffee and maybe something else. Something foolish. Something hopeful. "You know what, Lou?" John heard himself say, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Give me a Powerball ticket. Quick pick." Lou's eyebrows shot up in surprise. but he said nothing as he printed out the ticket. John handed over 2 of his precious dollars, leaving him with a mere $1.27 to his name. As he stepped back out into the cold Chicago morning, clutching his coffee in one hand and the lottery ticket in the other, John felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A tiny flicker of anticipation. It wasn't hope. He had long since learned the danger of hope, but it was something. He spent the rest of the day as he always did, wandering the streets, stopping occasionally to rest on park benches or in the public library where he could escape the cold and lose himself in books. But every so often, his hand would stray to his pocket, feeling the small slip of paper that represented an impossible dream. As night fell and the city lit up in a dazzling display of lights, John made his way back to his spot under the L. The roar of trains overhead had long since become a comforting white noise, a lullaby of urban life. Settling down on his flattened cardboard box, John pulled out the lottery ticket. In the dim light filtering down from the street, he could just make out the numbers. 7, 14, 22, 35, 48, and the Powerball, 12. "All right?" he whispered to himself, a hint of his old self peeking through the layers of hardship. "Let's see what you've got." With that, John tucked the ticket safely away and leaned back against the concrete pillar. As he drifted off to sleep, the rhythmic rumble of trains above him, he allowed himself to do something he hadn't done in years. He began to dream. Little did John know that those 6 numbers, chosen randomly by a machine, were about to set in motion a chain of events that would change not only his life but the lives of countless others. The winds of fate, as unpredictable as the Chicago gusts, were about to blow John Donovan's world wide open. As the city slept, carrying on in its relentless rhythm, a homeless man dreamed under the L tracks, unaware that tomorrow everything would change. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, a rarity for Chicago in late November. John stirred beneath his threadbare blanket, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the gaps in the L track above. For a moment, he lay still, savoring the unusual warmth on his face. Then reality set in, and with it, the familiar ache in his bones, a constant reminder of countless nights spent on cold concrete. As John sat up, wincing at the protest of his stiff muscles, his hand brushed against something in his pocket. The lottery ticket. Memories of yesterday's impulsive purchase flooded back, bringing with them a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. "Might as well check it," he muttered to himself, fishing out his battered flip phone, a lifeline provided by a local homeless outreach program. As he navigated to the Illinois lottery website with fumbling fingers, John chuckled darkly at the absurdity of it all. A homeless man checking lottery results on a phone that could barely load web pages. The numbers appeared on the tiny screen. 7, 14, 22, 35, 48, Powerball 12. John blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The numbers didn't change. They matched. All of them. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumble of the morning train overhead. "No, that's not possible." But it was. John Donovan, a man who had called the underside of a train track home for the past 5 years, was now the sole winner of a $400 million Powerball jackpot. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. John's breath came in short, sharp gasps as the magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. $400 million. It was more money than he had ever dreamed of, even in his most successful days. Clutching the ticket to his chest, John stumbled out from under the L and into the bustling street. The usual morning crowd flowed around him, but for once, he was oblivious to their averted gazes and wide berths. His feet carried him, almost of their own accord, to Lou's corner store. The bell jingled as he burst through the door, startling Lou, who was restocking the magazine rack. "John," Lou asked, concern etching his features. "You all right, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Words failed John. Instead, he thrust the ticket and his phone towards Lou, his hands shaking violently. Lou's eyes widened as he looked from the ticket to the phone and back again. "Holy mother of..." "John, you won? You actually won?" John nodded, a strangled laugh escaping his throat. "I won, Lou. I really won." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Lou, taking charge with surprising efficiency, closed the store and called his nephew, a local attorney. Within hours, John found himself in a sleek downtown office, surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, and lottery officials. As he sat there, listening to discussions about lump sums versus annuities, tax implications, and investment strategies, John felt oddly detached. The words washed over him, meaningless jargon that seemed to have no bearing on the reality he knew. "Mr. Donovan?" A voice cut through his daze. It was Sandra Chin, the lottery's public relations officer. "We'll need to schedule a press conference. As you know, Illinois requires lottery winners to be publicly identified. We're thinking day after tomorrow. That should give you some time to prepare." Prepare. The word echoed in John's mind. How does one prepare to go from sleeping under a train to being a multimillionaire overnight? As the meeting wrapped up and John prepared to leave, to where he wasn't sure. He could stay anywhere now. A thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. "Wait," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. I want to donate it. All of it." The silence deepened, stretching out for several long seconds before erupting into a cacophony of voices. "Mr. Donovan, I don't think you understand. That's a very generous thought, but perhaps we should discuss." "John, buddy, maybe you want to sleep on this." But John's mind was made up. As he looked around the room at these people with their expensive suits and pitying eyes, he felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. "No," he said firmly, silencing the room once more. "I understand perfectly. I've lived on the streets for 5 years. I've seen what desperation does to people. I've seen families torn apart, lives destroyed. And I've seen how a little help, at the right time, can make all the difference." He took a deep breath, surprised at the strength in his own voice. There are shelters out there running on shoestring budgets, soup kitchens that can barely keep their doors open, rehab centers with waiting lists a mile long. That's where this money needs to go. Not to me. I don't need it. I don't want it. Sandra Chin was the first to recover. "Mr. Donovan, that's an incredibly noble gesture. But are you sure? This is a life-changing amount of money." John smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his careworn face. "My life's already changed, Miss Chun. Let's change some others." And so, over the next 48 hours, a plan was put into motion. The entire $400 million jackpot would be donated to a carefully selected group of charities across Chicago, focusing on homeless outreach, addiction recovery, and poverty alleviation. As John stood at the podium 2 days later, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He told his story simply and honestly, explaining his decision without embellishment or self-aggrandizement. "I've been given a chance to make a difference," he concluded, his voice carried across the nation by countless live feeds. "And that's worth more than any amount of money." As he stepped away from the microphone, John was unaware of the storm that was about to break. He couldn't know that his act of selflessness was about to be twisted and dissected by a cynical world, that his motives would be questioned, his character attacked. For now, in this moment, John Donovan was simply a man who had found a purpose. A man who, after years of darkness, had finally found his light, and he was determined to share it with the world, no matter the cost. The day after the press conference, John Donovan woke up in a real bed for the first time in years. The small hotel room, provided by the lottery officials, felt cavernous and alien after so long on the streets. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process the whirlwind of the past few days. His phone, a new smartphone gifted by a well-wisher at the press conference, buzzed incessantly on the nightstand. John picked it up gingerly, still unused to its sleek design. The screen was flooded with notifications, missed calls, text messages, social media alerts. It seemed the whole world wanted a piece of John Donovan, the homeless man who won millions and gave it all away. Turning on the TV, John was confronted with his own face staring back at him from every news channel. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, they were all running the story. Clips from his press conference played on repeat, interspersed with commentary from a parade of pundits and experts. An unprecedented act of generosity, one anchor was saying. John Donovan, saint of the streets or fool? Read the ticker at the bottom of another channel. On ABC's Good Morning America, a panel was discussing the implications of his decision. It's a beautiful gesture, a celebrity philanthropist was saying, her perfectly coiffed hair gleaming under the studio lights. But you have to wonder if it's misguided. Couldn't he have done more good by managing the money himself? Personally, I think it's admirable, countered a gruff-looking economist. But it raises questions about our lottery system. Should we be allowing people in vulnerable positions to gamble like this? John switched off the TV, his head spinning. He had expected some attention, but this was overwhelming. Venturing out of his room, John made his way to a nearby diner. As he entered, a hush fell over the place. All eyes turned to him, a mix of curiosity, admiration, and something else. Something that made John's skin crawl. "Hey, it's the lottery guy," someone called out. Suddenly, John was surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, take selfies, offer their opinions on his decision. "You're an inspiration, man," said a young woman with tears in her eyes. "My cousin runs a shelter in Detroit," an elderly man told him. "You think you could throw some money their way too? You should have kept some for yourself," a middle-aged woman admonished. "You can't help others if you can't help yourself." By the time John managed to escape back to his hotel room, he felt drained. This, he realized, was his new reality. He was no longer invisible. He had become a spectacle. As the day wore on, John's phone continued to buzz. Curious, he opened Twitter, where his name was trending nationwide. Chi-Town Pride. John Donovan is what this city needs. A true hero. Hashtag Chicago Proud. Skeptical Sam. Anyone else think this Donovan story smells fishy? No one's that selfless. Hashtag lottery scam. Conspiracy Queen USA. Wake up, sheeple. Donovan is clearly a plant by big charity to guilt us into donating more. Hashtag follow the money. The comments went on and on. A dizzying mix of praise, skepticism, and outright hostility. John felt his chest tighten as he scrolled through the feed. This wasn't what he had wanted. He had hoped to do some good to help people like himself. Instead, he had become the center of a media circus. As the sun set over Chicago, casting long shadows across the city John had called home for so long, a news alert popped up on his phone. A local investigative journalist was raising questions about John's past, hinting at inconsistencies in his story. Just then, there was a knock at the door. John opened it to find Sandra Chen, the lottery PR officer, looking harried. "John, we need to talk," she said, her usual composure cracking slightly. "Things are escalating. There are reporters camped outside, and we're getting some concerning messages." "Concerning?" John asked, a knot forming in his stomach. Sandra hesitated. "Threats, John. We're getting threats. Against you, against the charities. Some people, they're angry. They think this is some kind of scam." John sank onto the bed, his head in his hands. "I don't understand," he mumbled. "I just wanted to help. Why are people so angry?" Sandra sat next to him, her voice softening. "People are complicated, John. Your story, it's challenging a lot of assumptions. About wealth, about charity, about what people would do in your situation. Some folks can't handle that challenge." As if to punctuate her words, angry shouts could be heard from the street below. John went to the window and peeked out. A small crowd had gathered, some holding signs. "Scammer," one read. "Give back the money," proclaimed another. Sandra joined him at the window, her face grim. "It's not safe for you here anymore, John. We need to move you. And we need to think about damage control." As John nodded numbly, gathering his meager possessions, he couldn't help but wonder, how had his act of kindness turned into this? And more importantly, where would it end? The sun had fully set now, the Chicago skyline a glittering backdrop to the growing chaos below. John Donovan, the man who had wanted nothing more than to help others, found himself at the center of a storm of his own making. And as he was ushered into a waiting car, ducking to avoid the cameras and angry faces, he realized with a sinking heart that this was only the beginning. The harsh studio lights bore down on John as he sat uncomfortably on the plush leather couch of The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. The roar of the audience felt distant, as if he were underwater. John tugged at the collar of his new shirt, a far cry from his usual worn attire, feeling like an imposter in his own skin. And we're back with our special guest, John Donovan. Jimmy Fallon's voice boomed, his trademark grin plastered across his face. The man who won the lottery and gave it all away. John, I gotta ask, what were you thinking? John cleared his throat, acutely aware of the millions of eyes watching him. I just wanted to help, Jimmy. There are so many people out there who need it more than I do. But come on, Jimmy pressed, his tone shifting subtly. For $100 million? You couldn't keep just a little for yourself? Maybe buy a nice house, a car. Before John could respond, Jimmy turned to his other guest, popular comedian Dave Chappelle. Dave, what would you do if you won the lottery? Dave leaned back, a mischievous glint in his eye. Man, I'd buy a solid gold toilet and eat caviar for breakfast. This guy, he jerked a thumb at John. He's either a saint or crazy. I'm leaning towards crazy. The audience erupted in laughter, and John felt his face burn with embarrassment. But seriously, Dave continued, his voice taking on a more pointed tone, something doesn't add up here. Nobody's that selfless. What's your angle, man? John stammered. There's no angle. Oh, come on, interrupted the third guest, controversial political commentator Tommy Lahren. We're supposed to believe that a homeless man wins millions and just gives it away? Please, this reeks of a publicity stunt. The audience murmured, a mix of agreement and uncertainty rippling through the crowd. Jimmy turned back to John, his expression now tinged with skepticism. John, there have been some questions about your background. Care to clarify? I don't understand, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. What questions? Well, Jimmy continued, pulling out a stack of cards. We did some digging. It seems you used to be an accountant. How does someone go from that to homeless? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. John felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. I had some problems, made some mistakes. It can happen to anyone. Problems? Tommy pounced. What kind of problems? Drugs? Gambling? Come on, John. The American people deserve the truth. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, more intense. John's vision swam, the faces of the host and guests blurring into grotesque masks of accusation. John stuttered, unable to form coherent thoughts. You know what I think? Dave chimed in, his comedic tone gone, replaced by something harder. I think this whole thing is a scam, a way to launder money or dodge taxes. Am I right, John? The audience gasped, then began to boo. John felt the weight of their judgment crushing him. Jimmy held up his hands, feigning an attempt at peace. Now, let's not jump to conclusions. John, here's your chance. Tell us the truth. Why did you really give away all that money? But John couldn't speak. The words stuck in his throat, choked by fear and humiliation. He sat there, mute and trembling, as the studio audience's boos grew louder. Well, folks, Jimmy said, turning to the camera with a smirk, I guess silence speaks louder than words. We'll be right back after this commercial break. Maybe by then, our generous friend here will find his voice. As the on-air sign dimmed and the audience chattered excitedly, John remained frozen on the couch. A production assistant approached, a look of disdain on her face. Mr. Donovan, you need to leave now. We'll be having a different guest for the next segment. In a daze, John allowed himself to be led off the stage. As he stumbled through the backstage area, he could hear snippets of conversation from the crew. Can you believe this guy? Total fraud. Bet he's running back to grab the money now. Outside the studio, a crowd had gathered. News of John's disastrous appearance had spread quickly. As he emerged, a chorus of jeers erupted. Liar! Give back the money! Fraud! Someone threw a soda can, narrowly missing John's head. Security guards rushed to escort him to a waiting car, shielding him from the angry mob. As the car sped away from the studio, John curled up in the back seat, his body racked with silent sobs. The city lights of New York blurred past the window, a gaudy reminder of the wealth he had given away and the price he was now paying for his decision. His phone buzzed incessantly. Social media notifications, missed calls, text messages. John didn't need to look to know what they said. In the span of an hour, he had been transformed from a national hero to a pariah. His act of charity twisted into something sinister by the unforgiving lens of public scrutiny. As the car merged onto the highway, heading back to the airport and the long flight to Chicago, John Donovan, once an anonymous homeless man, then briefly a celebrated philanthropist, and now a suspected fraud, closed his eyes, wishing he could disappear. But he knew that was impossible now. His face, his name, his story were known to millions. There was nowhere to hide from the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. The America that had once ignored him on the streets now couldn't look away, their gazes filled not with compassion, but with suspicion and contempt. As the New York skyline faded in the distance, John realized with a sinking heart that his ordeal was far from over. It was, in fact, only beginning. The warm glow of Chicago's skyline did little to comfort John as the taxi wound its way through the city streets. It had been 3 days since his disastrous appearance on The Tonight Show, and the world had become a hostile, unforgiving place. As the cab pulled up to the modest motel where John had been staying, a small crowd of reporters surged forward, camera flashes popping like strobe lights in the darkness. Mr. Donovan, care to comment on the fraud allegations? John, is it true you're planning to reclaim the lottery money? Donovan, how does it feel to be America's most hated con man? John pushed through the throng, head down, ignoring the barrage of questions. Inside his room, he collapsed onto the bed, the weight of the past few days crushing down on him. His phone buzzed incessantly, a torrent of hate messages, death threats, and demands for explanations flooding his social media accounts. Truth Seeker 1776. This Donovan guy is everything wrong with America. Hashtag Donovan the Con Man. Chicago Watchdog. Sources say John Donovan had gambling debts. Is this lottery donation just a cover-up? Hashtag LotteryGate. Midwest Mom 4. My kids looked up to you at John Donovan. How dare you lie to America? Hashtag shame on you. Sleep eluded John that night, as it had for the past several nights. When he finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, his dreams were plagued by jeering faces and accusing fingers. The next day, John ventured out in search of breakfast, a baseball cap pulled low over his face in a futile attempt at anonymity. As he walked into a local diner, a hush fell over the room. Then, a voice rang out. Well, if it isn't the Saint of Chicago. A burly man stood up, his face contorted with anger. Come to scam some more good people out of their money? Before John could react, a glob of ketchup-covered hash browns hit him square in the chest. Laughter erupted as John stumbled backwards, the door chiming cheerily as he fled back onto the street. His sanctuary gone, John found himself wandering the very streets he had called home for so long. But even here, there was no peace to be found. As he passed a group of homeless men huddled around a burning trash can, one of them recognized him. Hey, ain't you that lottery guy? The one who said he was going to help us? John nodded warily, hoping against hope for a friendly face. The man spat at John's feet. You're full of shit, man. Where's all that help you promised? Bet you kept it all for yourself, didn't you? The others joined in, hurling insults and empty bottles. John ran, their angry shouts echoing in his ears. Desperate for shelter, John made his way to St. Mary's, a church that ran a homeless outreach program. He had volunteered there in the past, helping serve meals when he could. Surely they would understand. But as he approached, he saw Sister Margaret, the program coordinator, speaking to a group of reporters on the church steps. And while we appreciate Mr. Donovan's alleged intentions, we cannot in good conscience accept donations that may have been obtained through fraudulent means, she was saying, her face a mask of disappointment. John's heart sank. Even here, in this place of sanctuary, he was no longer welcome. As the day wore on, John found himself in Millennium Park, sitting on a bench and watching families enjoy the late autumn sunshine. A young boy pointed at him, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy, isn't that the bad man from TV?" The mother grabbed her son's hand, hurrying away while shooting John a look of pure disgust. That night, with nowhere else to go, John returned to his old spot under the L tracks. The familiar rumble of trains overhead was no longer comforting, instead serving as a bitter reminder of how far he had fallen. As he settled onto the cold concrete, a voice called out from the shadows. "Well, well, look who's back." 3 men emerged, their faces twisted with malice. John recognized them as locals who had always resented the attention he got from outreach workers. "Thought you were too good for us now, lottery man?" one sneered, cracking his knuckles ominously. "Please," John said, his voice hoarse. "I've got nothing. I gave it all away, just like I said." "Liar!" Another man lunged forward, his fist connecting with John's jaw. Pain exploded through John's head as he fell back, more blows raining down on him. "This is for making fools of us all." The beating seemed to last an eternity. When it finally stopped, John lay curled on the ground, tasting blood and feeling the sting of torn skin and bruised flesh. As his attackers melted back into the shadows, John remained motionless, the cold of the concrete seeping into his battered body. Overhead, the L train thundered past, oblivious to the broken man below. In that moment, surrounded by the debris of his old life and the shattered remnants of his attempt to do good, John Donovan felt utterly, completely alone. The city he had tried to help had turned on him, twisting his act of generosity into something ugly and suspicious. As consciousness began to slip away, John's last thoughts were of the cruel irony of his situation. He had won a fortune and given it all away in hopes of making a difference. Now he had less than nothing or no money, no home, and no hope. The first light of dawn broke over Chicago, illuminating a city that had once ignored John Donovan, then briefly celebrated him, and now reviled him. And in the harsh light of that new day, a man who had dared to be selfless in a selfish world lay beaten and abandoned, a vivid testament to the sometimes terrible cost of good intentions. The bustling newsroom of the Chicago Tribune hummed with activity, the clatter of keyboards and murmur of voices creating a familiar symphony of journalism in action. Amidst the organized chaos, Sarah Chand sat at her desk, brow furrowed in concentration as she scrolled through pages of online comments and social media posts. At 32, Sarah had already made a name for herself as one of the Tribune's most tenacious investigative reporters. Her series on corruption in the Chicago Police Department had earned her a Pulitzer nomination the previous year. Now, she found herself drawn to a story that had captivated and divided the nation. The saga of John Donovan. "John, my office now." The gruff voice of her editor, Mike Harrigan, cut through the newsroom noise. Sarah sighed, knowing what was coming. She'd been pushing to investigate the Donovan story for weeks, but Mike had been resistant, claiming it was old news. As she entered Mike's office, he was already shaking his head. "Don't tell me you're still on about the lottery guy." Sarah stood her ground. "Mike, there's more to this story. I can feel it." "More?" Mike scoffed. "The guy's a fraud, Sarah. End of story." The public's moved on. "Have they?" Sarah pulled out her tablet, showing Mike the latest social media trends. Donovan's still trending. People are still angry, still curious. And nobody's asked the most important question. Why? Mike leaned back in his chair, eyeing Sarah skeptically. Why what? Why would a man win millions and give it all away? Why would he subject himself to this level of scrutiny and hate if he didn't have to? Sarah's eyes gleamed with the excitement of a mystery unsolved. "It doesn't add up, Mike." For a long moment, Mike said nothing. Then, with a heavy sigh, he waved his hand. Fine, you've got 2 weeks. But if this turns out to be nothing more than a puff piece on a con artist, it's on you. Sarah grinned, already halfway out the door. Thanks, Mike. You won't regret this. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity for Sarah. She pored over every piece of public information about John Donovan, from old tax records to social media posts. She interviewed former colleagues, neighbors, anyone who might have known John before he became infamous. What emerged was a picture far more complex than the media had portrayed. John Donovan had indeed been a successful accountant, with a promising career and a comfortable life. His descent into homelessness wasn't sudden, but a gradual spiral triggered by the 2008 financial crisis. He was a good man, Mrs. Leibovitz, John's former neighbor, told Sarah over a cup of tea, always helping others, even when things got tough for him. It broke my heart to see him lose everything. As Sarah dug deeper, she uncovered a pattern of small acts of kindness throughout John's life, even during his years on the street. Homeless shelter volunteers spoke of a man who always tried to help others, despite having nothing himself. But the more Sarah uncovered, the more questions arose. If John was truly the selfless, why had he bought a lottery ticket in the first place? And if he was a fraud, as so many claimed, where was the evidence? The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Sarah had been trying to track down John's ex-wife, Emily, for days. Finally, she agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. Emily was a petite woman with tired eyes and a wary expression. "I don't know what else I can tell you that hasn't already been said," she began, stirring her coffee absently. "I'm not looking for sensationalism, Mrs. Donovan," Sarah assured her. "I just want to understand John, who he really is." Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a deep breath, she reached into her purse and pulled out a worn envelope. "I found this after John left. I've never shown it to anyone else." Inside the envelope was a letter, dated just days before John had disappeared into homelessness. Sarah read it with growing amazement. It was a heartfelt apology from John to Emily, explaining his decisions and his deepest regrets. One passage stood out. "I've realized that my pursuit of wealth and status has cost me everything that truly matters. If I ever get another chance, I swear I'll make it right. I'll find a way to help others, to make a real difference in the world." Sarah's mind raced. This letter, written years before the lottery win, seemed to foreshadow John's decision to donate all the money. It painted a picture of a man grappling with his mistakes, seeking redemption. As she left the cafe, Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert. Her heart sank as she read the headline, "Lottery Board launches investigation into Donovan donation." The story was far from over and time was running out. Sarah knew she needed to find John himself if she wanted to uncover the full truth. But where was he now? And in what condition? As rain pattered against the windows of her car, Sarah made a decision. She would find John Donovan, whatever it took. She owed it to him and to the truth to tell his real story. With renewed determination, Sarah headed back to the Tribune, her mind already formulating a plan. The real investigation was just beginning, and she had a feeling that what she would uncover would shock the nation once again. Little did Sarah know that her search for the truth would lead her down a path far darker and more complex than she could have imagined, bringing her face to face with a reality that would challenge everything she thought she knew about John Donovan and the power of human compassion. The fluorescent lights of Cook County Hospital buzzed overhead as Sarah Chun hurried down the sterile corridor. Her heart raced, not from the brisk pace, but from the anticipation of what she might discover. After weeks of dead ends and false leads, she had finally tracked down John Donovan. "Room 742, the nurse had said, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and respect. "But he's not in good shape, Miss Chun. Don't expect too much." As Sarah approached the room, she steeled herself. The man she was about to meet had been vilified by the entire nation, painted as a fraud and a con artist. But her investigation had led her to believe there was much more to John Donovan's story. She knocked softly and entered. The sight that greeted her made her breath catch in her throat. John Donovan lay in the hospital bed, a mere shadow of the man she had seen in news footage just weeks ago. His face was gaunt, his skin sallow, and a variety of tubes and wires connected him to softly beeping machines. "Mr. Donovan?" Sarah said gently. "I'm Sarah Chun from the Chicago Tribune. I was hoping we could talk." John's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Sarah with effort. "Another reporter," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Come to get the scoop on the fraud of the century?" Sarah moved closer, pulling up a chair. "No, Mr. Donovan. I'm here to understand, to get the truth." For a long moment, John said nothing, studying Sarah's face. Then, with a slight nod, he began to speak. What followed was a story that shook Sarah to her core. John revealed that he had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer just days before buying the fateful lottery ticket. The doctors had given him weeks, maybe months to live. "I thought it was some cosmic joke," John said, pausing to catch his breath. "All those years on the street, and now that I had a death sentence, the universe hands me millions." He explained that the decision to donate the money was immediate and unwavering. "I was going to die anyway," he said, a hint of his old spirit flickering in his eyes. "But maybe, just maybe, that money could give life to others, could make a real difference." As John spoke, Sarah's recorder captured every word, but her mind was reeling. This wasn't just a story of charity or fraud. This was a man's last attempt to leave a positive mark on a world that had often been cruel to him. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Sarah asked, her journalistic instincts warring with her growing emotion. "About the cancer? It would have changed everything." John's laugh turned into a cough. "And what? Be pitied? Have people say I only did it because I was dying? No, I wanted the focus to be on the good the money could do, not on me." As their conversation continued, Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly. News alerts flashed across her screen. "Lottery board concludes investigation. No fraud found in Donovan case. Charities report positive impact of Donovan donations. Public opinion shifting. Hashtag re-examine Donovans trending nationwide." The world was already beginning to change its tune, but they didn't know the full story. Not yet. As she left John's room hours later, Sarah's mind was racing. She had the story of a lifetime, but more than that, she had a responsibility. To John, to the truth, and to a public that had been too quick to judge. Back at the Tribune, Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard. The story poured out of her. John's diagnosis, his decision, the real reasons behind his actions. She wrote of a man facing death who chose to give life to others, of courage in the face of public scorn, of a final, selfless act in a world all too often driven by self-interest. As she typed the final words, Sarah looked up to see the entire newsroom gathered around her desk, Mike Harrigan at the forefront. "Tell me you've got something, Chun," Mike said, his gruff voice tinged with anticipation. Sarah nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It's the story of the year, Mike. Maybe of the decade." What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Fact-checkers pored over every detail. The legal team worked overtime to ensure everything was airtight. And through it all, Sarah felt the weight of John's trust, of the truth he had entrusted to her. As dawn broke over Chicago, the presses of the Tribune roared to life. Across the city, newspaper trucks began their rounds. And on smartphones and tablets everywhere, notifications chimed with breaking news alerts. The headline read, "The Truth Behind the Lottery, John Donovan's Final Gift to the World." Sarah sat in the quiet of the empty newsroom, a fresh copy of the Tribune in her hands. She had done it. The truth was out there. But as she read her own words, a new fear gripped her heart. John Donovan was dying. The public would soon know everything. And Sarah realized that the story she had worked so hard to uncover was far from over. In fact, the most crucial chapter was yet to be written. With renewed determination, Sarah grabbed her coat and headed for the door. There was more work to be done, more truth to be told. And somewhere in a hospital room, a man who had given everything was facing his final days alone. The clock was ticking, and Sarah Chun was once again racing against time. The city of Chicago awoke to a crisp autumn morning, the streets buzzing with an energy that went beyond the usual workday rush. At newsstands and on smartphones across the city, the same headline dominated. John Donovan. The truth behind the $400 million donation. Sarah Chen's exposé in the Chicago Tribune had broken overnight, and by dawn, it had gone viral. National news networks scrambled to cover the story, their previous narratives of fraud and deceit crumbling in the face of the heart-wrenching truth. In diners, offices, and homes across America, people read about John's terminal diagnosis, his decision to give away his lottery winnings, and his choice to face public scorn rather than seek sympathy. The nation that had so quickly turned on him now grappled with a complex mix of emotions: shock, guilt, admiration, and profound sadness. At Cook County Hospital, John Donovan lay unaware of the seismic shift in public opinion. His condition had deteriorated rapidly, and doctors didn't expect him to regain consciousness. Sarah sat by his bedside, holding his hand, a quiet vigil for a man she had come to deeply respect. Outside the hospital, a crowd began to gather. What started as a handful of curious onlookers soon swelled into hundreds, then thousands. They brought flowers, candles, and hastily made signs. "We're sorry, John. Thank you for your generosity. Forgive us." Social media exploded with an outpouring of support and regret. Chicago Mayor John Donovan's sacrifice and generosity embody the very best of our city. We owe him a debt we can never repay. #Thank you, John. Ellen DeGeneres. I was wrong about John Donovan, and I'm deeply sorry. His courage and selflessness are an inspiration to us all. We must do better. #Lessons learned. CNN breaking. Charities benefiting from Donovan donation report life-changing impacts. Thousands of lives improved across Chicago. #Donovan's legacy. As the day wore on, the crowd outside the hospital continued to grow. Vigils sprang up in cities across the country. The White House announced that the president would make a statement later that evening. Inside the hospital room, monitored by the steady beep of machines, John Donovan took his last breath at 7:42 p.m., with Sarah Chen by his side. He passed away peacefully, never knowing that his final wish, for his actions to make a real difference, had been realized beyond his wildest dreams. The news of John's passing spread quickly, and the nation plunged into mourning. Flags were lowered to half-mast, an honor usually reserved for national heroes and fallen presidents. In the days that followed, something remarkable happened. Inspired by John's story, people across the country began performing acts of kindness, big and small. Donations to charities soared. Volunteers flooded homeless shelters. Stories of generosity and compassion dominated the news cycle, replacing the usual litany of crime and political bickering. A week after John's passing, Chicago witnessed one of the largest public gatherings in its history. Grant Park, the sprawling green heart of the city, was filled to capacity as hundreds of thousands came to pay their respects at a memorial service for John Donovan. The service was a who's who of American society. Politicians, celebrities, and business leaders sat shoulder to shoulder with social workers, charity organizers, and formerly homeless individuals whose lives had been changed by John's donation. Sarah Chen, invited to speak, stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. John Donovan was not a saint. He was a man who made mistakes, faced hardships, and in his final days made a choice. A choice to give everything he had to make the world a little better. In doing so, he held a mirror up to our society, showing us both our capacity for judgment and our potential for compassion. As Sarah spoke, giant screens around the park displayed images of John's life, from his days as a successful accountant to his years on the street, and finally, his moment of unexpected fortune and ultimate sacrifice. John's legacy, Sarah continued, her voice thick with emotion, is not just the millions he gave away, it's the challenge he left us, to be kinder, to judge less and understand more, to recognize that every person, no matter their circumstances, has value and deserves dignity. The ceremony concluded with a citywide moment of silence, followed by a performance by a choir of homeless and formerly homeless individuals, many of whom had benefited directly from John's donation. As twilight fell over Chicago, the sky lit up with thousands of lanterns released by the crowd, each bearing messages of hope, gratitude, and promises to carry forward John's legacy of kindness. In the weeks and months that followed, the Donovan effect, as it came to be known, continued to ripple across the nation. Legislation was introduced to reform lottery systems and provide better support for winners. Homelessness and mental health became topics of national conversation, leading to increased funding and innovative programs. 1 year after John's passing, on a crisp autumn day much like the one on which he had bought that fateful lottery ticket, a statue was unveiled in Millennium Park. It depicted John not as the successful accountant he once was, nor as the broken man he had become, but as something in between, a simple man extending a helping hand. The plaque at the base read, John Donovan, 1977 to 2024. In his final act, he taught us all how to live. As the afternoon sun glinted off the statue's bronze surface, Sarah Chun stood in the crowd, a bittersweet smile on her face. She thought about the man she had barely known but whose story had changed her life, and the lives of so many others. In that moment, as she watched children playing around the statue, people pausing to read the plaque, and tourists snapping photos, Sarah realized that John had achieved something remarkable. In a world that often seemed dark and selfish, he had sparked a light of hope and kindness. And as the breeze carried the first fallen leaves of autumn across the park, that light showed no signs of dimming. So, if you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button below and join our community. Based on your interests, we've picked this story for you that's showing on your screen right now. Click to watch it now. We're sure you'll love it. See you next time.